let's talk about how to import and export stuff in JavaScript. Starting in 2015 with the ES6 standard, JavaScript provided a very useful way to bring stuff, to import stuff from one component to one component from the other, from another one. I think it's fair to say that historically speaking that wasn't possible and that was a bit complicated. That's why we had to, we depend on non-standards like CommonJS or AMD. And actually, if you've started working with Node, probably you've noticed that the way you import and export stuff in Node is not the same. The syntax is different, even though the concept, the principle is the same, but the syntax is different, right? So now this migrating to the new ES6 pattern is not, I think, part of the latest version yet, but I think at some point it will be there, which will be great, right? Because that will mean that we'll be able to reuse the same syntax on the front end JavaScript and on the back end JavaScript. So why we need to import and export? Well, that's easy to grasp, right? Because eventually our app will grow, so we don't want to have a massive app.js file with hundreds of thousands of lines of code. We want to separate our components, our functionalities, our data into several components, right? This is obvious. So I'm going to play with the basic. This is going to be quite basic, to be honest. But I think it's basic, it's easy, but it's important. So I'm going to create a very simple UI with a couple of players, and we'll show the score of each player, something like that, something very easy, right? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new file called players. And in players, I'm going to create a function called getPlayers. So the getPlayers function will return an array of players, right? With the first name, last name, score if you want, right? Whatever. And then let's set another one, first name, last name, score. Yeah. Right. So, yeah. So now, if I want to display the list of players on the UI, so you'll tell me, what do I have to do here? Import. Correct. Import what? Get players from. You see that Visual Studio is helping you. Once you type /, it's showing you the files on the current folder. We'll talk about how to find files in your working project. But for now, let's keep it easy, right? So if you notice, we got players and app.js into the same folder, right? So that's the way you reference. And then what? Here I want to display the list of players. We call the function curly braces, yeah? I want to display first name, last name, and a score. Before going any further, we got an error, right? Remember, I used to recommend when you have an error, before adding more functionality, right, just try to fix the error. Otherwise, the snowball, is getting bigger. So why is it failing? Correct. Exactly. So app.js is correct because we're importing a file, but in the new file players, we are not exporting it. How do we export it? Correct. So Marta is suggesting to do something like that. Export default, something like that. Right. Okay, this is right. This is valid. So listen, when we export something, there are multiple ways to export things. This is one of them. The reason why I started with this is not because I like it, it's because I've seen that multiple times. Even on professional developers, they used to do that. I'm not a big fan of that. Actually, even the main app file that comes with React is the same thing. You see, export default at the bottom. Why I don't like it? Because you need to scroll to the bottom to see what the component is exporting. The export thingy is probably the most important line on the entire file because it is where the component expresses what will become public. You eventually may have multiple functions, but at the end of the day, probably most of the time you just want to return one, right? That's why even though this is correct, and let me comment that, right? Even though this is correct, I personally prefer to put it inline. What inline means? Get rid of that, and then once you declare the function, you export it. Why prefer it? First of all, because you don't have to scroll down, right? And then it's the first thing, line number one, export, right? You clearly express to your colleagues what do you want to make public, right? Again, it's just a matter of styling. Both alternatives are equally valid. Cool, so then what? We got get players. So we want to display first name, last name, and score. So how do we do that to get rid of the error? With this what? Props where? You've done that already in the gallery, right? Most of you. That's number.
This dot props function.
This dot props.
I don't know.
I mean, what is this returning? What is the highlighted text returning? What type of data?
Array.
An array, correct. How do we display an array of whatever in React? You've done that on the gallery. Which method on the array can iterate and then display something? Really, no one? Map. Thank you. With map, remember, we have an array. We have this array, and then we return another array of the same size. So we have an array of 2 elements, and then we want to return another array, right, of 2 HTML elements. What do we put inside of the map? Function. Let's use ES6. So tell me, argument name. Player. Thank you. Player. Yeah, let's keep it like that, right? So can I do that? Player.first name. Of course I can, right? You see? So here we said, hey, I have a list of players. For each one, just display his or her name, right? If we want to improve the UI a bit, let's think about UX. So we can always do that, right? We can add a div surrounding each player. And of course, we can move it to a new line for readability purposes, remember. Yep, so something like that. Correct, right? So now we got 2 divs, 1 div for each player, and of course we can add some decorators like titles, blah, 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 right? It's not the goal of this workshop, but let's try to make it a bit elegant. Right, so we already have we know how to display the first name, but how do we display the last name? Right, easy. The only thing we need to do is go here, space, player.lastname, right? And it works. But now I got a question for you. What happens if I don't really want to do that? Because this is, it's sometimes, imagine that we don't have the last name, or sometimes we want to display the email, you know, we want to change that a bit. You remember there was, I think, on the beginners challenge, there was a question that say, if we got the last name, display welcome Mr. whatever. If not, then, you know, there was some if else. So we may have some if else logic in here, right? And actually, let's do it. So I got email also. So email is john@lewis.com, and then here, right, something like that. So data model on each player may change depending on whatever. We don't care about why, right? But you see that, for example, the first player doesn't have any last name, but the second player has, right? So the first player looks a bit weird if we want to set a welcome message, right? Welcome, welcome. Yeah. So our business manager has advised to do something a bit different. If we don't have the last name, then display the email. This is an example, right? So because it could be a bit challenging to write all this if-else logic here, we want to create a new function here. Look, function get welcome message. And it receives the player. And then you'll tell me the logic. We want to say if, or get display name. If we got the last name, then return first name and last name. If we don't have the last name, then just return email. So Chandon, how do we solve that?
Me?
Yeah, of course you.
If
what?
player
Correct. Good. Then what? What do we return?
return access.
Yeah, why not? Let's do actives, yeah?
$sign.
Yeah. Player dot what?
The last name.
Player dot last name. Well, we're going to show the first name and the last name. Will this work? Look at the color. So the colors are a bit, you know, when it gets displayed in orange, it's like, there is something not quite right. So what's missing? Correct. So Victor is right. Remember, Chandong, to surround your variables with
You're not going to say welcome in front of.
we can put, yeah, I mean, we can put the welcome outside and then welcome first name, last name, or welcome email, right? That doesn't matter. That doesn't have to be perfect, right? And else what, Sandon? Return what? User.email. Oh, like that? Is that correct, Sandon?
No.
Why? Curly braces. Where? Here?
It's not going to work
Why? G?
because the user isn't.
Correct. G is correct. Why you call it user and not Sandon? It won't make any difference, right? User doesn't exist. So how should we call it? Player. Correct. Correct. Okay. That's good, right? Could we use a ternary operator instead to simplify this if-else structure? How? Jim? Yeah. 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 That thing. Something like that, right? Cool. Please, today on the coding challenge, I don't want to see anyone doing this. This is absolutely unacceptable, right? So you get an unnecessary penalty. When you have a long ternary operator, not necessarily huge, but to me this is, you see, have you noticed this vertical line here? So this is a way to tell you, please try to, you know, to break the code across several lines, right? For readability purposes. So if that's the case, look, we got the condition. If the condition is met, we return this. Oops, we return this. If not, we return that. Okay, easy. Right. So now I want to call the get display name function in here. I don't want to do that, right? How do we do it? Curly braces, and then what? Get display name, like that, with a player inside. Right, this is not going to work. Right, the error is pretty obvious, right? Look, get display name is not defined. We have to import it. Correct, remember, export, import. It's the same thing all the time, right? But now we got a small problem here because we said export default. So
Take the default off, because it's default meaning that's the only function that can be exported from that file.
not really, but let's take that as a source of truth. So export default makes a lot of sense if we want to export something, just that function. But in that particular case, we don't want to export one function, we want to export two functions, right? So the basic or the obvious way to proceed is get rid of the default, right? And then you export the get players function, and then you export the other one, right? Does it make sense? But now, what do we have to change here? Look, that doesn't work anymore, right? I was working, and now it says attempted import error. Correct, correct. So you've noticed that sometimes you have curly braces, but sometimes you don't have curly braces. So when you don't have curly braces, it's because you have a single export. But if you have more than one export, you need to declare which ones do you want to import. That's why here you need a comma-separated list within curly braces, and then what do we put on the second one? Correct. And now, voila, it works, right? On the first user, we display the email because we don't have the last name, and on the second player, we display first name, last name because we have all the details. Does it make any sense? But now, probably you may be thinking about something. So what happened? What happened if, I don't know how to do it now, right now. So if we created the get players function 3 months ago, now we are importing it from 2000 components. But now, because it's not export default anymore, that means that we have to rename, we have to replace this line 2000 times, right? Because before we got that, we got get players. But now, because it's not export default anymore, we have to surround it by curly brackets. You know what I mean? We have to change not only the export, but also all the imports, right? Even if we don't care about that, you see, before we got that, but now because we have another function, we had to do that to fix the issue. So this is inconvenient, right? Because we don't want to change 2000 files just because we move from export default to just a normal export. Because of that, there is a different way to do this, even though I like how we've done it, but in some cases that may not be feasible. So the way to do it is you can leave the export default, we can leave what you got before, right, and change, but then look at what you can do. You can have get players without the brackets, and then comma, and then get display name. Right, so get players, right? You see, it still works. Which probably you've noticed that this is what on the first line of React app, this is what's happening, right? So React is like the main component that we want to export. And then there will be other utilities that you may want to import. So in this particular case, if we have a module called players, the main component, the main function we want to export is get players. And then, optionally, we may want to import that one as well. Both approaches are equally valid. That's up to you. If you want my suggestion, in the long term, I would rather prefer to have one exported function per file. So instead of doing this, I would rather prefer to do that, of creating a new file called something like player's name or something like that, right? So then we got export default. So in other words, everything is an export default because every file exports one component, right? So then to fix that, how do we fix that? Another import, exactly. Marta is right, because it's in a new file, we need another import. Import what? Get display name from the other file, right? And then it works, right? So this is just a personal advice. Even though you may be thinking, oh, this is stupid, if this is such a simple thing, why don't we merge it? Why don't we keep it in a single file? In the long term, I suggest to have one file, one export. As simple as that. Because if there is a bug here, if I want to change that functionality, for me, it's much easier to remember that I have a file called player's name, and the logic is there, right? However, if I have 10 exportable methods on each file, the functionality may be a bit hidden. So even though the number of files will increase, obviously, to me, that proves to be better in terms of scalability. Is there any question? That's pretty much it. The last thing I would like to explain is what happens if our file is on a separate folder. Let's refactor this a bit. Because we got players and players name, I want to create a folder called players. And within that folder, I'm going to move my two shiny components inside of it. You see? So now the logic is encapsulated. So obviously now this is not working. You see, no such file or directory, because the file is not within in that directory anymore. So what do we have to change here?
Dot slash.
Correct. Dot slash what? So
What's the name of the folder? Was it just players?
yeah, correct. So dot slash.
Players.
And look, Visual Studio is helping you, right? So you can just navigate through it,
Yeah, slash.
players, and the same thing in the one below, right? Players name, right? And that should work. Any question? No? The very last question is, and we'll leave it there. And what happens if the file structure is a bit different and we want to import something which is in one directory above? I'll show you the example. So imagine that we have a new file called test. Yeah, sorry, I cannot think about a good example now. But that function export default function get random stuff return. No, actually, let's do it right. So instead of displaying a welcome message here, what I want to do is I want to have a function called welcome, right? And that function welcome will do get welcome. It's a bit silly, and that will display welcome, right? Something as simple as that. So I want, as part of the player name component, the only thing I want here is to set welcome, first name, last name, or welcome player.email. So I want to import that file, that welcome file. How do we import it? If you notice, welcome is not on the same directory. It's one level above, right? So how do we import it? First of all, what's the name method? Let's put it underneath. Function get welcome from where? That's the problem. Dot slash what? No, wrong. Dot slash. Correct. Right. So Ben is right. So if we do dot slash, it will search on the current directory. But we don't want that. We want to go one level up, right? So to do that, // and again, look, Visual Studio will tell you what's going on that folder, right? Obviously, in some cases, you may want to do // it depends, right? So we can keep going up. Does it make sense? So that's the way you go to one file from the other, right? But in this particular case, because it's one level above, it's easy, right? // welcome. And then, obviously, we can do that, right? Get welcome, and then we can even do get welcome here, right? Oops. So something like that. Yes. Right. So that's the way you access a file that is in a different directory, in a parent directory. If I were you, I will optimize this a bit. This is off topic, right? Well, I will optimize this because we're calling the same function twice, which is not very elegant. So if I were you, I would create a variable here called let's display name equals, and then I will do this logic, the one we did before without the welcome. So first of all, I want the display name. That will be either the first name or the last name. And then finally, I'll return get welcome plus display name. So that's the same thing, but it's a bit more elegant because we have to call the welcome function just once, right? The code is a bit shorter. But again, this is off topic. This is not related to the import-export workshop. Any question? That's a good point. That's a good point. So I'm going to change that a bit. Instead of creating a function called getPlayers, look, what Marta is suggesting is, can we do that? Can we do, oops, export default, right, right. Right, so we can do that. The reason why it's not working is because on the main app.js, we are still thinking this is a function, but it's not, because now what are we exporting? What? A what? Array. An array, correct. So what do we have to change here? Players. Let's see if it works.
What's the variable called?
That's a good question. That's a good question. Look, first of all, it works. So Marta, yes, we can do it. But can I change players by Victors? It works.
That's what you name the variable.
Yes. So look, when we do export default, that means that we're exporting one single thing. Could be a function, could be an object, could be an array, could be a string, whatever. We export one thing. Because we're exporting one thing, we can only import one thing. Because of that, it doesn't matter what you import here. Whatever you import, however you label this thingy, it will be assigned to the export default. That's why we have that flexibility, right? But what happens if I remove the default now? Look, pay attention. If I remove the default, look, you see the export is in red. That's not valid. You cannot export an array like that. Why? Because if we don't have the default, that means that we can export multiple things. Correct. When we export multiple things, we need to label them. Because otherwise, how do we know now if Victor points to this array, or if Victor points to this other array, or if Victor, we don't know it. Because of that, if we want to export multiple things, like that, it's better to create a variable, let players equals, right? And then at the end, we can do export players. And now, so will it work if I add a curly brackets surrounding Victors? No. Correct. Why not?
That's not the name of the variable.
Correct. Correct. Export. Just give me a second. Right. So that's still right. So when we do export, remember, if we do it in that way, now the problem is Victors is not there, right? So now we have to explicitly set that the variable name we're going to import is players, correct? Right? And then obviously we change it in the UI, and then it works. But what happened? What happened if instead of players, our colleague decided to call this variable players that are awesome in the platform? So this is, he thought that was a good naming, right? So obviously now this doesn't work, so we have to change it here, which is, we don't want to do that, right? Someone didn't probably thought about the good naming conventions, but we don't want to keep referencing to that variable all the time. And this is the last thing for the day. So what we can do here is to set an alias. An alias means I want to import that variable, but instead of referring it 20 times on my UI with this very ugly name, I want to do that. What? As, exactly. So when we do whatever as whatever else, it means that now we can simply do this, right? Say it again? Correct. Correct. The hijacking with the workshop presented by Marta and Alex, so they did something like that. Import browser router as router. So in that particular case, again, router is probably simpler to use than browser router. And I guess here there are legacy reasons, because maybe on previous versions of React Router DOM, they were using router. So it's a way to keep the code a bit more consistent with legacy components. But anyway, yeah, that's literally the same thing, right? Import something. This is what someone is exporting, and then we rename it. The good thing about renaming is not just to minimize the impact of bad naming conventions. It's also to avoid conflicts. What happened if we have another component called, I don't know, if we have that. This is not going to work, but imagine that we have two examples, two files. One file returns the, for example, bootcamp players. And another file is exporting meetup players. They both export the same variable, players. But this is not going to work, right? Why? Because this variable is overwriting this one. So we'll never have access to the meetup players. For this kind of situations, the aliases are useful, are convenient, because they solve the conflict. You can do players as meetup players, and then players as internal players. And then we can do whatever we want, because these variables are now unique. Right? Easy, right? Any question? No? Right? So let's leave it here. Thank you, guys.